Hey my friends, have a great Saturday everyone. The Detroit Lions have made a move that looks small on the surface, but when you look at the circumstances surrounding it, it tells us something important about what this team needs right now. Detroit has signed veteran running back Travion Williams, formerly of the Cincinnati Bengals, on August 14th, and the timing is directly connected to injuries in the Lions' backfield during training camp. Williams was originally a 6th-round pick out of Texas A&M in 2019, and the biggest part of his value has been his ability to contribute on special teams and as a blocker. Last season, his production as a runner was limited, with 10 carries for 36 yards, but that is not really the reason Detroit brought him in. The Lions need bodies, they need experience, and more importantly, they need players who can take meaningful repetitions while other players are dealing with injuries. That becomes especially important during training camp and preseason, when the depth chart gets stretched and the team has to put 3rd, 4th, and 5th string players on the field. Bringing in a veteran like Williams gives Detroit another option and allows the coaching staff to manage those repetitions without unnecessarily exposing players they are counting on for the regular season. This does not necessarily mean Williams is going to make the 53-man roster. In fact, the source makes it clear that this could simply be a short-term depth move. If the Lions get healthier, his opportunity could disappear quickly, but that does not make the signing meaningless. In August, depth matters. Injuries can force a team to change how it practices, how it distributes snaps, and even how it evaluates its younger players. For now, Wilson gives Detroit another experienced body while the team works through those issues. And that brings us to a much bigger issue surrounding this Lions roster: availability. Detroit cannot afford to keep losing players during this part of the year. The team needs its young players to string together good practices, establish consistency, and prove that they can be trusted when the regular season arrives. A depth signing like Williams is one thing, but the bigger concern is whether the Lions can actually keep the players already on the roster healthy enough to compete for their jobs. That concern becomes even more interesting when we look at what happened with former first-round pick Terrion Arnold. Arnold is no longer with Detroit after the Lions moved on from him, and he has now reached an agreement with the Seattle Seahawks. The reaction from some fans may be simple. If another NFL team was willing to sign him, why did Detroit let him go? But that question misses the bigger point. According to the information we're looking at, the Lions' decision was about more than talent. The organization had concerns involving Arnold's off-field situation and the trust between the player and the team. The source specifically points to Arnold not being truthful with Dan Campbell and Brad Holmes, along with concerns about whether he was living up to the expectations that came with being a first-round selection. And this is where the decision becomes less about football talent and more about the culture Detroit is trying to build. The Lions have made it clear that they want players who can be trusted both on and off the field. They do not want unnecessary distractions surrounding the team, especially when they are trying to compete in 2026. So when Seattle decided to take a chance on Arnold, that does not automatically mean Detroit made a mistake. It simply means two organizations can evaluate the same player differently and decide that different risks are worth taking. John Harbaugh's comments about the situation explain the other side of that decision. His point was that NFL teams are always looking for talent. The margins are extremely small in this league, and teams are constantly searching for players who might give them an advantage. Even players who have made mistakes can still receive opportunities somewhere else. That is simply how the NFL works. But the fact that another team wants a player does not mean the Lions have to want that player too. Detroit has its own standards, its own expectations, and its own direction. The organization has decided that avoiding distractions and maintaining trust inside the building is important enough to move on from a talented player when those standards are not met. And honestly, that is one of the most important parts of this entire situation. The Lions are not saying that Arnold can never have another opportunity. The source even makes the point that people can deserve second chances, especially when they are young. The difference is that Detroit does not have to be the place where that second chance happens. Now the attention turns back to the current roster, because there is another situation that could have much more immediate consequences for Detroit's 2026 plans. The latest concern involves Ennis Rakestraw Jr., and while the injury itself was described as minor, that is not necessarily the end of the conversation. Dan Campbell described the issue as a contusion in the arm that caused some numbness, while also indicating that he expected Rakestraw to be alright. right. On paper, that sounds like good news, but the larger concern is not necessarily this individual injury. It is the pattern. The source argues that Rakestraw has struggled to string together healthy, productive days, and that has become a serious problem as the Lions evaluate their defensive depth. The issue is no longer simply whether one injury is major or minor. The question is whether Detroit can trust him to stay available consistently enough to justify keeping him on the roster. That is a completely different question. The source points out that Rakestraw needs to start putting together good days, and that other defensive backs, including Khalil Dorsey and Roger McCreary, are currently ahead of him. He has also reportedly been graded poorly during the evaluation process. When you combine that with the repeated injury concerns, the pressure on Rakestraw becomes obvious, and this is where the phrase, "the best ability is availability," becomes extremely important. A player does not necessarily have to be a superstar to have value in the NFL, but the coaching staff has to know that player will be available when the team needs him. If a player is constantly missing time or struggling to get through practices and games, eventually the organization has to ask whether the roster spot could be better used elsewhere. That does not mean the Lions have already made a decision on Rakestraw. It means the pressure is increasing. For a player who entered the league with expectations of becoming an important part of the defense, this is a critical moment. He needs to stay healthy, he needs to put together consistent practices, and he needs to show the coaching staff that they can depend on him. Because while Detroit can bring in a veteran running back to temporarily fill a depth problem, the Lions cannot solve every roster issue by constantly adding another player. At some point, the players already on the roster have to prove that they can stay on the field and contribute, and that may be the biggest story coming out of all of this. The Trayvon Wilson signing is about depth. The Terrion Arnold situation is about trust and organizational standards. But the Rakestraw situation is about something that every NFL team needs: consistency. The Lions are building a team for 2026, and every roster decision matters. A player who can contribute when healthy has value, but a player who cannot consistently stay healthy puts the coaching staff in a difficult position. With other defensive backs competing for opportunities, Rakestraw may not have unlimited time to change the narrative. So now the question for Lions fans is simple. Do you believe Detroit made the right decision moving on from Terrion Arnold? And do you think Ennis Rakestraw Jr. has done enough to earn another opportunity? Or has his lack of consistency finally made him a potential cut candidate? And that is exactly why this situation with Ennis Rakestraw Jr. deserves attention, because the Lions are now at the point where potential alone is not enough. Rakestraw was selected by Detroit in the second round of the 2024 NFL Draft, and the organization clearly believed he could become an important part of this defense. But now, with the competition around him and the concerns about his consistency, the pressure is real. The Lions need to see something from him, and they need to see it consistently. The important thing here is that Detroit does not have to make an emotional decision. The coaching staff has the opportunity to evaluate every practice, every preseason opportunity, and every repetition. If Rakestraw can stay healthy and show that he can compete at the level the team expects, he can change this conversation. But if the same problems continue, the Lions have other players who are ready to take advantage of those opportunities. That is what makes training camp so important. Every repetition matters because roster spots are not guaranteed. A player can enter camp with expectations and still find himself fighting just to remain on the roster. On the other side, a player who was not expected to receive much attention can suddenly make enough plays to force the coaching staff to reconsider the depth chart. That is also why the Trayvon Wilson signing makes sense, even if it does not look like a major transaction. Detroit is not necessarily looking for a superstar every time it makes a move. Sometimes the smartest move is simply protecting the rest of the roster. If injuries are limiting the running back room, bringing in an experienced player allows the Lions to keep practicing and evaluating the players they really want to see. And Wilson has something Detroit can use immediately: experience. He has been in the NFL since being drafted in 2019, and his value has been tied heavily to special teams and blocking. That gives the Lions another player who understands the physical demands of the league and can step into a training camp environment without needing to learn everything from the beginning. But again, this is not a guarantee that he will be on the roster when the regular season begins. That distinction is important. There is a difference between signing a player because you believe he is going to be a major contributor and signing a player because you you need someone who can take reps right now. The information surrounding Wilson points much more toward the second situation. Detroit needs depth while dealing with injuries, and Wilson gives them another option. If the players ahead of him get healthy and perform well, Wilson could eventually become expendable. If injuries continue, however, his value could increase. That is the reality of August in the NFL. Meanwhile, the Terrion Arnold situation has moved into a completely different phase. Arnold has now found another opportunity with Seattle, and that gives us a chance to see how different organizations handle difficult roster decisions. The Lions decided that their standards and their concerns about the situation were more important than holding on to the former first-round pick. Seattle has decided to take the chance. Neither decision changes what Detroit has already decided. The Lions have to focus on the players who are actually going to be part of this team moving forward. The Arnold chapter is over in Detroit, and now the focus has to shift toward the defensive backs who are still here and the players competing for those roles. That makes Rakestraw's situation even more important. If Detroit is going to move forward without Arnold, the remaining cornerbacks have to take advantage of the opportunities in front of them. This is where Rakestraw has a chance to change everything. He does not need to answer every question in one practice. He does not need to suddenly become a star overnight, but he does need to show that the coaching staff can trust him. That starts with staying on the field. The physical side of football is unavoidable. Injuries happen, and nobody should be criticized simply because they get hurt. But from a team's perspective, availability still matters. Coaches have to build packages, rotations, and game plans around players they expect to have available. If one player